Hey, Jay Carper here from American Torah, and it's Passover this week. Well, Passover is kind of a funny word. It actually refers to the animal in Scripture, not necessarily the day. In the New Testament, the words get a little fuzzy where the entire period of Passover and unleavened bread, and even the weeks leading up to it, can be called Passover. But technically, Passover is the animal that is killed on the 14th of Nisan. The Feast of Unleavened Bread begins on the 15th of Nisan and goes for 7 days. So we're right in the middle of the Feast of Unleavened Bread right now. And so if you are an observant Jew or one of most of Torah keeping believers in Yeshua, that's where you're at, right there with me. So I'm going to read from Exodus 12, verses 14 through 20, and this is the first command about the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So this day shall be to you a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast to Yahweh throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses, for whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation, and on the 7th day there shall be a holy convocation for you. No manner of work shall be done on them, but that which everyone must eat. That only may be prepared for you. So you shall observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread, for on this same day I will have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. For 7 days no leaven shall be found in your houses, since whoever eats what is leavened, that same person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is a stranger or a native of the land. You shall eat nothing leavened. In all your dwellings you shall eat unleavened bread. Okay, so for 7 days you will eat only unleavened bread as opposed to leavened bread. If you don't understand those terms, leavened bread is the fluffy bread with lots of bubbles and holes in it. Most bread that you eat is leavened. Unleavened bread is something that hasn't risen. So tortillas, crackers, things of that nature, flatbreads, tend to be unleavened bread. Although that's not guaranteed, you need to look at the ingredients to be sure. There are 2 words used in the Hebrew here for these concepts. Unleavened bread is Chometz. Leavening is Seor. Leavening is the stuff that you put into the bread dough to make it rise. And there are several different things that people use today to make this happen. They can use live yeast cultures or what's called sourdough bread. You start with a little piece of dough in water and you let it sit. And yeast that's in the atmosphere colonizes that dough and starts to grow in it. And then when you want to make more bread, you make your raw dough, you mix a little bit of this starter dough, the lump or yeast culture, I'm sure there's a technical name for it, I don't really know what that is. You mix that in with your dough and then you let it sit for a while. The yeast is a living organism inside the dough, and it multiplies and grows and it creates gases inside there, which is what makes the bread fluffy and full of little holes. So Chometz is the end product. It is bread that has been leavened through fermentation by yeast. Seor is the starter dough that contains the yeast culture. Now both of these words have to do with fermentation. So unleavened bread is bread that has not been fermented with yeast. Leavened bread is bread that has had yeast fermenting inside of it. Both of these words have to do with fermentation, but since the context is only about bread, it's not talking about anything that could be fermented. It's not talking about sauerkraut or wine or pickled herring, anything like that. I don't know if pickled herring is fermented or not, but I know that some canned fish is fermented, and that sounds disgusting to me. But in any case, this is talking about bread and bread products. There are some rabbinic traditions about what exactly this means. What do you have to remove from your home for unleavened bread? At the more extreme, strict end, you remove all leavened bread, all bread products that contain yeast or leavening agents like baking powder or baking soda. I don't understand the chemical process or the baking process there, so I might get the terms mixed up. Anything that contains yeast or yeast extracts like autolyzed yeast extract or anything like that in the ingredients. Anything that contains grains with liquid, and that includes lentils. Lentils aren't technically a grain, but the rabbis will include lentils because they can be ground like flour and made into a bread, and they will ferment if they're left in water. So pretty much anything that could contain yeast or a leavening agent, they will remove from the home. On the opposite end of the spectrum, the most lenient side, people will remove only leavened bread and a starter lump if they've got one. They don't count like yeast packets in the refrigerator, any products that might contain yeast as an ingredient, only if it contains leavened bread itself. Pizza, some breading for some products that are, breaded and fried or breaded and baked, whatever. Sometimes they contain leavening, sometimes they don't. You just have to look. Myself, my interpretation falls somewhere in the middle. I'm not going to bother with fermented foods that aren't bread. But certainly anything that contains a grain product and yeast, I'll remove that. Now, I don't consider killed yeast leavening. Let me give you an example. You can buy nutritional yeast. It's not a live yeast culture. It can't be used to leaven anything. If you mix it with bread or mix it with dough, it's not going to rise. So I don't consider that to be leavening for the purposes of the commandment. Only things that have been fermented with yeast. So beer, it's got grain and it's been fermented with a yeast culture. Pizza doughs, regular bread, even if it's like cornbread, if it's got leavening in it, well, it has yeast, a live yeast culture that was used to ferment it, then I count that as leavening, or either Chometz or Seor, depending on what you're talking about. Wine doesn't count. If it's like a can of soup and it's got a yeast extract, I don't count that because the yeast wasn't used to leaven the grain content. It was only used as a flavor enhancer or a thickener or something like that. It wasn't even live when it was added. It was something extracted from yeast and not a live yeast culture itself. Now, there are some values. I don't follow the rabbinic rules on this, but there is a lot of value in it if you want to give it a shot. It can be a little overwhelming to remove everything that has leavening from your house, but there are some benefits. The first benefit is it forces you to know what you're eating. You have to read the ingredients on everything. That's something you should do anyways. You should always read the ingredients before you buy food so you know what it is you're eating. How do you know if there's something unclean in it? How do you know that it's even really food instead of just a bunch of chemicals? So you have to search your whole house. And Scripture uses leavening as a metaphor of sin and of false teachings. And so searching through your house is like searching through your life for sin that you didn't know was there or that you've forgotten about, for false teachings that you may have picked up somewhere and you don't know where. And searching your life for these things is a constant, ongoing process. And one of the things that people who go through this process every year for unleavened bread will almost always tell you is that they've cleaned out their house, they've searched every cabinet, searched through the freezer and refrigerators. Halfway through the week of unleavened bread, they'll find a can of soup in the back of the cabinet that has yeast in it, or they'll find some breadcrumbs somewhere and clean out the breadcrumbs from the toaster and the oven and everywhere else. It's leavened bread. You got to clean it out. So this is a really useful process. It can teach you things. It's a great object lesson about the effects of yeast in sin and the places that sin hides in your life. But I don't think it's necessary to strictly obey the commandment. I think removing all leavened bread from your home, all live yeast, including the starter dough, remove that from your home. I think that's good enough. I don't think that you need to needlessly complicate your life unless you see value in it. But you need to read the scriptures for yourself. You need to read these passages, and let me give you those passages. Exodus chapter 12. Might as well just read the whole thing because it's scattered all through there. Exodus chapter 13, Leviticus chapter 23, Numbers chapter 28, and Deuteronomy chapter 16. Read those passages for yourself. You need to be sure, you need to be clear in your own conscience about what you're doing and whether you are obeying God's instructions for your life. Nobody else can do that for you. And you come to your own decision about what constitutes leavening and leavened bread. And next year when Passover rolls around, make sure you've got it out of your house before the end of the 14th of Nisan. You'll have to check the internet or your calendar or ask your local congregation about the dates. Because your average calendar and your average email program, they don't have the Hebrew months and dates on them. In any case, keep the feast, honor Yeshua in it, because he is everywhere in it. And this is Jake Harper from American Torah. Be blessed.